Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nicole Leggett. I'm the Executive Director of the Office for Prevention of Family and Domestic Violence from the Department of Communities. Thank you for joining us for this afternoon's non-mandatory briefing regarding the request for tender for developing a family and domestic violence workforce entity. We still have a few people joining us, so I'm just going to take us through a little bit of housekeeping before I get into the main body of today's briefing. Firstly, can I acknowledge that I'm joining you today from Boorloo on Whadjuk Noongar Boodja and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging, and also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands that you all are joining us from today, which I expect might be all over the state and perhaps even interstate. Today's briefing is to provide an opportunity for people to hear a little bit about the project that we are currently seeking requests for tender around, and that is the design of a family and domestic violence workforce entity. The way that the briefing will run is that I will work through some information which is largely drawn from the request document itself. Simon Doyle, who is the procurement contact, will talk a little bit about process, and then we will do Q&A. So as we work through the presentation, please post your questions in the chat and I'll deal with all of those questions at the end of the session. There will be time at the end for you to post your questions as well, but we'll keep an eye on them as they go, so make sure we provision enough time to get through all of the questions. The other two things that I wanted to let you know, one is that this presentation is being recorded and will be made available on Tenders WA, but there will be a lag in it being uploaded to Tenders WA of a few days. So in the meantime, we will transcribe the Q&A into written question and answer format, and that will be provided as an addendum on Tenders WA as quickly as possible for anybody who hasn't been able to be here in person for the tender briefing today. So with that housekeeping out of the way, thank you again for joining us this afternoon. And this particular request relates to designing a family and domestic violence workforce entity. So I'm just going to work through some slides, which so to offer some background, and apologies for those of you who've been part of one of these tender briefing processes already, because I'm largely going to cover the same information. But to offer some context, between September of last year and March of this year, the government convened a family and domestic violence task force. And can I just check that you can still see my slides, because all of a sudden I can see all of you. No slides? Okay, my apologies. Yep. Looking good now? Thanks, Simon. So last year, government convened a task force. The task force had a number of responsibilities, one of which was to look at systems responses to family and domestic violence. And I guess to really, boil that down into a nutshell, the brief of the task force was to look at the ways that all agencies, government, non-government and Aboriginal community controlled, respond to family and domestic violence. And really that was in recognition that in addition to specialist family and domestic violence services, which are critically important in our response to family violence, so too is the important role that all other kind of complementary and aligned services play, right through from police, justice, communities, health, education, and all of the suite of non-government services in the community, including Aboriginal community-controlled organisations. So some of the things that the task force considered was not only about the individual responses to victim survivors and people using violence, but also about how those agencies and organisations work together and the importance of there being those seamless responses to people experiencing violence that address all the range of their needs in order to deliver the best outcomes. So one of the outcomes of the task force was to develop a system reform plan. And that plan is organised around 4 areas, being workforce development, risk assessment, risk management, and information sharing. And the project that I'm briefing you on today, which is about establishing a family and domestic violence workforce entity, is a priority reform action in the workforce development pillar in that plan. The other thing that I really want to note is that the system reform plan, in how it's designed, although it has distinct actions, they are highly interrelated. So when we think about workforce development, what we're actually thinking about is how we are supporting people and organisations to respond to people who are experiencing and using violence, including how they use and adopt practices that are aligned with risk assessment, risk management, and information sharing, which exist in other parts of the plan. So it's all quite woven together. So generated from the consultations that informed the task force, as well as the key asks of the sector that were instrumental in the creation of the task force, there has been already a basic framework established about what this workforce entity would do. And essentially the early view, which absolutely needs further design, and that's what this request is about, but the early view is that of great need in Western Australia is a family and domestic violence workforce entity that supports system-wide workforce where everyone is clear about their roles and responsibilities in responding to family and domestic violence. The view is that the entity needs to have a role beyond just training, that training would be a key part of that role, but equally important might be supporting quality assurance of training material that's produced outside of the entity, potentially by organisations and agencies themselves, or perhaps looking to other states and territories for training packages that could be localised in WA. Equally important is a view of workforce and workforce development beyond just training, and the ways that this entity can support strategic efforts around identifying, recruiting and retaining workforces that provides for, provides an opportunity for them to do many different types of activities in that space, all with the common view and outcome of how we're supporting family violence informed practice. So I suppose the key message on this entity is it's not specifically just a training organisation. It can take a broader view about the many ways in which workforces might need to be cultivated, supported and developed to be family violence informed, including to be able to take a nuanced approach that recognises that the needs in a government agency might be quite different to the needs in a specialist family violence service, which might be quite different to the needs in a non-government organisation that's in an allied sector like homelessness or alcohol and other drug or mental health. So what we are looking for is a consultant who can help us do the co-design work to get to the next level of detail about the role and functions for this workforce entity. So this piece of work is absolutely and very much about the actual design of what this entity will do and how it should do it. That would lead into a procurement process. So I guess from a context point of view, the operating budget for the entity is already established, and that is at $2 million per annum. So we need to do a design piece that is within that funding envelope. And related to that, we need to be really clear about what are the functions that this entity performs, what is the structure and composition of the entity, so that we can use that as the informing framework for the procurement process. In terms of the governance sitting around this particular project, the Department of Communities is the lead contractor and will be responsible for the contract management of the project. But the the inputs to this project will be much broader than just the Department of Communities. So it will be supported by a working group which has representation from government, community sector organisation, peak bodies, Aboriginal community controlled organisations, and potentially academia and community members as well. So the actual membership on that group is still being determined, and it's being determined by an implementation oversight group, which has responsibility for oversight and delivery of the whole system reform plan. So the next implementation oversight group meeting is the 10th of July. And at that meeting, they'll be drilling down into the composition of working groups, including in relation to membership. The activities that we are looking to, that we are looking for a consultant to undertake in the scope of this project is about designing the functions of the entity itself and gathering together information that informs, I suppose, like a strategic plan for that organisation, if I can put it that way. We're not looking for you to develop a strategic plan, but essentially to identify and gather together the source information that will be necessary and valuable both for designing the functions and for getting the entity set off on the right foot about some of their prioritisation of effort, understanding that their remit is quite broad and their funding envelope is at about $2 million per annum. So some of the activities that we have put together for the consultant include developing a baseline for specialist services, in terms of describing the workforce. So specialist services in this space very clearly exists in the non-government sector in terms of all the family and domestic violence services that are funded by government. But equally, there are pockets of specialisation that exist within government. And there's very clearly pockets of specialisation that exist within Aboriginal communities and Aboriginal community controlled organisations, including some of those that are receiving family violence funding. So what we're trying to get a picture of is the what does that workforce currently look like? What is their access to training? And what are the existing workforce development initiatives that sit in this space? We are keen to mirror that, but perhaps in a little bit less detail around non-specialist services, so that we can inform a view about within the allocation of resource that there is for this workforce entity, how do we kind of prioritise or allocate a priority around target cohorts and audiences for focus of effort from this entity when it's established. The third part is about being really clear about the workforce development landscape in Western Australia, including existing avenues for specialist training. We're keen to have insights and advice about similar entities in other jurisdictions. And there is actually some work that's already been generated which informed the thinking of the task force that we will share with the successful consultant. So some basic jurisdictional scanning that's already been completed. We are keen for a piece of work around the key barriers and opportunities related to supporting family violence informed workforces. But perhaps most importantly, and a significant part of this project, is facilitating that process of co-design around what the entity should do and really getting into detail around unpacking its functions. Because although the direction of the task force is that it should be more than a training organisation, it doesn't have infinite resourcing. So we want to be really clear about what the priority functions are and how that matches to a prioritisation in cohorts and audiences that might have a higher priority for, time and effort in the establishment of the entity. The deliverables will include a project plan outlining how the consultant will approach the work, a stakeholder engagement plan, and both of these things will be developed in consultation with the working group, a draft report distilling and analysing evidence gathered in the activities above, we've got in here about preparing a presentation on findings. So number 3 and 4, sorry, draft report, presentation, and then a final report. And all of the draft report, presentation, and final report encompassing the whole scope. So the design work as well as the scanning work. I'm going to hand over to my colleague Simon in just a moment, but what I wanted to signal, and it's actually something that we will publish as an addendum on Tenders WA, is that there is a timeline around the sequencing of these deliverables that we need to be more explicit about. And although this project will run over 12 months and the final products are needed until the end of that 12-month period, we will be wanting to have early insights about the functions of that entity towards the end of this calendar year. And so what we will do is in the project planning and the stakeholder engagement planning, be really clear about what those threshold points are, like what is enough to start us on the road of that early procurement planning versus, you know, everything that we need for the end of the project when we're ready to go to market. So there is an iteration in this project that we will be working through with the consultant, but I think you can reasonably expect that we would be wanting some of that stakeholder engagement work to be well underway and progressed in this calendar year up to December, rather than all being held over to the first half of next year, being between January and June. So we'd really like to see that stakeholder engagement piece get a good run this calendar year, and the write-up and the analysis continuing into next calendar year. Simon, can I get you to speak to this slide, please?
Yes, thanks, Nicole. Hello, everyone. Just to give you a quick rundown on procurement processes, you should be aware that registration on Tenders WA is essential for this procurement. That's in order to receive any addendum, and also it's where you have to lodge your actual submission to the request. Nicole just briefly mentioned that an addendum would be posted. I just want to point out that there is a pre-requirement stated in the request that states that organisations need to be an Aboriginal community controlled organisation or an Aboriginal registered business. That is incorrect. It's open to all services, so we'll be posting an addendum to that effect for yourselves. When you get to fill out your form, please ensure that you complete all of Part B, the content requirements and respondents offer component. You'll note that the criteria is, there's 2 criteria which have equal weighting, that is suitability of proposed services and specified personnel. I also want to point out, please make sure you have enough time to submit your application. The application is closed on the 16th of July at 2:30 p.m. and there will be no late applications accepted. The tender box is monitored externally, and we have no say in terms of those that come after the fact. They will not be included if they're not there in time. If you've got any queries or any issues, my contact details are on the request document, and on the basis of your query, it may put out an addendum to all our services, or it might be something that I'll just respond to yourselves directly, depending on the nature of the query. So thanks, Nicole.
Thank you, Simon. So I've just taken the slides down so I can monitor the Q&A. Okay, so I'm just going to start at the top. So the first question is, have you included lived experience voices? So this is a great question. Thank you for that. What I will say is that in the period of time that we are working with a consultant to develop this, develop the design around the entity and how it will operate, the government will also be establishing a lived experience advisory group. So there will be an opportunity to work with that group that will report directly to the Minister for Prevention of Family and Domestic Violence on the form and function of this entity as it develops through the design process. But added to that, we can also work with our working group to identify people with lived experience who we would like to engage earlier than that. So lived experience absolutely is very important, and we can work with the consultant about a range of ways that we achieve that. So that's something that we can work through together. The next question is, noting that the work on the framework that informs this is being done in parallel, I was wondering if there had been any thoughts on combining the two projects. It's a great question, and to be honest, it's something that we really mulled over in relation to all of these projects because they're so interrelated and they really interconnect in a lot of different ways. And many of you would know that we're actually out to market for 4 consultant projects at the moment, one being the Common Risk Assessment as Risk Management Framework, one being a dedicated risk assessment tool for Aboriginal family violence, development of a workforce capability framework, and development of this workforce entity. So I think probably what we'll be looking to do is support engagement and contract management with consultants in a way that helps us hold together and manage their various parts so that they can carry on as their own distinct projects, but that we manage where those intersect points are, and particularly those intersect points around stakeholder engagement, so that we are sharing generated content where that's relevant, but also making sure that we're not duplicating too much and treading over the top of each other. So there's going to be a strong coordination role for communities here about how we see these 4 projects roll out into the sector and with our stakeholders and community. That is all the questions at this point in time, but I will pause. So please feel free to put any other questions or comments that you have in the chat, and I'll be happy to attend to them. And I can see that we've got a hand up, and Joanne, please go ahead and ask your question.
I just wanted to apologise because I've put my name down for the other 4 groups, the 3 groups, but I do a lot of workshop meetings and advocacy through all spaces, homelessness, health, mental health, you name it. And to be honest, we need to actually align this with all of those as well, because it all happens together. Because, you know, you go through domestic violence and suddenly you end up homeless.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I just thought I'd share with you, but I'm interested in being a part of all those groups, and I could bring a lot to the table for us of information. So thank you, ladies.
Thank you, Joanne. I really actually appreciate your comment because it's absolutely spot on, and it's something that I has been remiss of me not to mention in context of this project, like the others, is all of this work is about trying to lift practice across all of those intersect point with victim survivors of family and domestic violence, whether they be in health settings, education settings, housing and homelessness settings, mental health, alcohol and other drug. We understand that people who experience and use violence are sitting in our service system in many places other than just in dedicated family violence responses. So really the work of all of these projects is about how we lift that base and foundation of practice across the board, understanding that we need to also apply nuance. Not everyone's got the same role, not everyone's going to have the same expectation of specialisation, but what are those roles and responsibilities? So this workforce entity really has to be able to straddle that nuance. It needs to have an understanding about what some of that foundational training that's going to be relevant en masse to very large cohorts, and what some of that really kind of deep specialist practice that might be important for narrower cohorts. So I suppose that's why we are so keen to actually take some time around the design of this entity, because we know it's critically important. We've got a predetermined budget envelope, and we really want to have the best opportunity at targeting that resource so that we're getting the best impact and outcome.
Wonderful. Thank you, my dears. That's awesome.
So great question. The next question is, given that the project plan is to be co-designed by the successful consultant, how much detail do you expect in the tender submission? So I think the answer to that question is you really need to put as much into it as gives us a flavour of what we could expect if you were to be awarded the contract. So need to know potentially about how you would approach the work and particular methodologies, if you like, around some of the stakeholder engagement and co-design. I guess what we'll be looking to do isn't to wholesale change what you've put forward. It's apply that nuance and help to layer that with the various stakeholder groups that we'd be keen to engage. So I don't expect it'll be an entirely new project plan than what you've submitted. It will just be around layering in the community aspect and kind of the political aspect, if I can put it that way, about the groups that we need to be engaged with. So the next question is, can I please expand on the 2 million per annum for the entity? Is this for the workforce accreditation standards, or is this to go towards jobs? Further clarification would be great, please. Thank you for the question. The 2 million for the entity per annum is for the total operating of this organisation on a yearly basis. So it's inclusive of the staff for the organisation, as well as whatever the operating budget might be that they need to be established. And building out an idea about that is important, but we won't be able to completely predetermine their cost structure, because some of that will be determined in the procurement process itself. What we probably have license and ability to do is say these are the key functions for this entity that must be delivered within that envelope, and an expectation about some of the ways that that will happen, but then we'll be putting it to market for responses, and you know, there's some of that will be worked out through that competitive procurement process. Okay, we've got about 1 minute to go, and it doesn't seem like we've got any other questions in the chat. So perhaps I'll just reiterate what we said at the top, which is that please don't hesitate to get in touch with Simon with any questions or points of clarification that you have as you're working through your responses. Simon will respond to that either directly to you or via an addendum on Tenders WA, and that's really just about managing the probity on the process and making sure that everyone has access to the same information in informing their responses. We will do a write-up of this question and answer, and that will be provided as an addendum on Tenders WA as quickly as possible. And the recording of this whole session will also be made available, but there will be a lag of a few days on that just while we get it kind of in the right format and cleaned up. So you can expect the Q&A written before you'll be able to access the full recording. And I guess with all of that said, I just wanted to say thank you again for joining us. It's great to see a great response. We're very excited about this work. So we really look forward to reading your responses when they come through. So thank you for taking the time this afternoon. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for allowing me to join your meeting.
Thank you, Joanne.
And please get in contact with me. I'm so sorry for missing the other ones, but yeah, because I just do so much advocacy, and they popped into my calendar when I'd already had bookings on my calendars.
Oh, no, I understand. And we scheduled them at such short notice. So, Joanne, appreciate you being here today, and we'll certainly, be thinking about you for all the work in this space.
Yeah, that would be wonderful because, yeah, that's great. Thank you, my
That's
darling.
great. All right. Thanks,
No worries.
Joanne.